G'day and welcome to Golos Tabletop, where everyone's welcome. Oh, almost. After the monk video that I made a few days ago, I was sitting around and thinking about some variants I'd made for the fighter class as well, to address some of the perceived issues with that class as well. I came up with one that was not particularly elegant, but it was very simple. So I thought I'd share it and a streamlined version of it with you today. Before we talk about fixing the fighter, we need to understand the place that it has within the system as a whole. And I think there's two major parts to that. For one thing, there's this idea that you're the tough, determined, resilient fighter with a weapon who's not going to give up regardless of the situation. It's why we have features like the second wind. It's why we have Indomitable, and to a lesser extent Action Surge. Mind you, I've also described most of the fighter's features, but anyway, we're going to move on to the second part, which is you understand combat. You're the combat specialist. You know weapons, you know armor, you know shields. You know how to control a battlefield or control a one-on-one fight more specifically. You you generally so normally this would mean grappling, shoving, tripping, controlling with shield, controlling with weapon. But we don't really see a lot of that part of things in the core class. There's lots of proficiencies, there's lots of understanding weaponry, armor, and shields, and that's all fine. But the part where the class falls down a little bit is the combat prowess specifically. That's why Battlemaster is one of the more popular subclasses even now, even though it's very much PHB content and there's been a lot of fighter subclasses since. Battlemaster is still one of the best. And I think that holds the key to fixing the fighter. We're making that class that fits in that fantasy of being both tough and determined and being able to master combat. But we really only have one subclass that does that? That doesn't seem right, does it?
So the obvious solution is just to smash the Battlemaster features into the core class. And this means that the class table ends up looking a lot like this here. So what we've done is instead of putting it at level 3, which it would be if it were the archetype that you were picking, we have it in a level earlier than it would be ordinarily. Although there is one point where it's a little bit later, but regardless, we'll sort of go through bit by bit. So combat superiority is when you first get the maneuvers. It's basically unchanged from the subclass. In fact, the maneuvers themselves are unchanged. You start off with three maneuvers and 4 superiority dice like you normally would. But then the next level you get your martial archetype. At level 5th you get 2 more maneuvers, 1 more superiority dice, and know your enemy. This is a couple of levels earlier than you get your archetype feature. However, the 6th level is already fairly loaded, so there's no real point adding more to that. And next up, so we got 5 and 5 when you get extra attack and know your enemy. And when we get Indomitable, we also get our next lot of maneuvers. We get our second extra attack and an extra superiority dice at the same time. We get more maneuvers when we get our second use of Indomitable. And we get 2 more when we get our second use of Action Surge and our third use of Indomitable. And the level after that, we get our D12 superiority dice. So here you can see that it is usually before, but there are a few points where it's apart from your normal archetype feature slot, which it would have been before. The main difference here is Relentless, which would be the subclass capstone for Battlemaster. It instead goes when you get the level 15 martial archetype feature. So, we've had to do a little bit of shuffling, and this is to keep certain levels from getting too loaded. If we just kept them on the martial archetype levels, it would get to be a bit much all at once, especially when we're trying to keep that opt-in complexity. We don't want to swamp people with new stuff all at once. Our second solution, which is slightly more elegant, is to simply strip the combat superiority and the superiority dice out of our system from version 1. You'll also notice that we've reduced the amount of maneuvers known from 2 to 10, down from 3 to 11. There's a few reasons for that, and we'll go through in a little bit. So here, it's virtually the same as the Player's Handbook fighter table. We've just added maneuvers here at level 2, just like we did in our version 1, but without the dice. We've also kept in Know Your Enemy from number 5. I still feel like that adds this ability for the fighter to analyze a situation. It doesn't necessarily need to be combat. It also gives us another something that a fighter can do outside of combat, which it currently doesn't really have. And that's a flaw with a lot of the martials. Barring your rangers and your paladins and your rogue to an extent, but your fighters and your monks specifically don't have much to do outside of combat. For rogues, it's more like when they're not in combat and when they're not sneaking, they don't necessarily do much. Although there are a few subclasses that are different. Anyway, let's move on. Let's get back on track and talk about our maneuvers a little bit, because we've changed the feature slightly from combat superiority. Except in concept. I should say it's the same concept, we've just made a few changes here. So, you learn maneuvers that enhance your combat prowess, which are listed at the end of the class description. Same. You learn 2 of them, as opposed to 3. They enhance an attack in some way. You can only use 1 maneuver per attack. You learn 2 additional maneuvers of your choice at 5th, 9th, 13th, and 17th level. I think that's actually unchanged from the class as a whole, but, the subclass. Each time you learn new maneuvers, you can replace 1 maneuver you know with a different one. Some of them have a save, it's calculated the same as before. You gain proficiency with 1 artisan's tools of your choice, that's unchanged. This we did change. Additionally, you can replace any attack on your turn with the following actions, which is to say, each time you attack, you might be able to do one of these. So with disarm, you attempt to disarm the target. It's very similar to the disarm action in the DMG, just as an attack. You'll notice that no damage is done here. You're also foregoing damage. Making the overrun action, again from the DMG, an attack. Basically, the thought process there is you're rushing through and you're forcing your way through, but you're doing it as an attack instead of as an action like you ordinarily would have to. So we replace, you'll see we've replaced Goading Strike with a taunt mechanic, an actual taunt mechanic. You attempt to goad the target into attacking you. If they fail their wisdom saving throw, they have disadvantage on all attack rolls against targets other than you until the end of your next turn. Again, because we've taken out Disarming Strike and Goading Strike, that's another reason to reduce the amount of maneuvers known. And Tumble, which is similar to the Tumble action from the DMG, just, again, as an attack. So let's go through the maneuvers a little bit. Some of these end up being slightly more awkward than they perhaps would have been with superiority dice, but we've stripped them out, so we're kind of stuck with it. In fact, we go straight into 2 that would have been very useful with the superiority dice. So, Ambush, when you make a dex check, a stealth check or an initiative roll, you add half your proficiency bonus to the roll with those provisos. You also can't use a maneuver on any attack during the first round of combat. So you can still attack, you just can't use maneuvers on those attacks if you use ambush. Same thing with bait and switch. When you use the bait and switch maneuver, you can't use a maneuver on any attack until the beginning of your next turn. So it's slightly different, but still, if you use it on your second your second turn, you can't use it until the beginning of your third turn. Brace, it becomes a reaction that you use when a creature moves into your threatened range. It's very similar to Polar Master, just with all weapons. Command an ally becomes commanding strike. You forgo one of your attacks and use a bonus action to direct someone else to strike. Presence just adds proficiency bonus doubling for intimidation, performance, or persuasion checks. There is another one that does something similar, but we'll get to that later. Distraction is the same as distracting strike. It's also similar to the hindering action from the playtest back when 5th edition was still D&D Next. So that's a little bit of history there for you. Evasive footwork is another one of those that was awkward because we removed the superiority dice. Evasive footwork worked really well for that. We've just said half proficiency bonus to AC until you stop moving. Feint just becomes a thing you can do, bonus action, and you can get an advantage on your very next attack roll. Again, tying it to the bonus action does mean that you can only do it once per turn. So a little bit of balancing there. Grappling strike is basically unchanged. We just don't add. We don't have the superiority dice in there, and we have the proficiency bonus doubled for this check. Lunge just becomes a thing you can do. A maneuvering attack just becomes a thing you can do. Menacing attack, again, just a thing. Parrying. This one was, again, another one of those where we could have just used superiority dice. Here we've used 1d10 plus strength or dexterity modifier, closer to second wind, but not quite as good. Precision attack becomes a 1d10, very similar to the archer stat block. It has an ability that means that you use a bonus action to use 1d10 on the roll. Except I think they have to do it beforehand. You can do it before or after. Pushing attack does exactly what it says on the tin. Does this normal amount of damage. There's no additional damage on that. Quick toss just becomes, again, a thing you can do as a bonus action. Rally, it's 1d10 plus charisma modifier. Again, one of those ones that would have worked great with a superiority dice, but we don't have those. Riposte just becomes a reaction. Sweeping attack, it's basically just making cleave official. Tactical assessment is another one of those ones where we have. Well, firstly, it's also something you don't necessarily have to be in combat to do, so you can do that during social situations or exploration or whatever. And also, it doubles your proficiency bonus for those ability checks. And then trip attack is just normal. We could even simplify this further by taking a few of these out, segregating them by level, or even having a few of them, such as trip and parry, be similar to that disarm, overrun, tumble, taunt one. And then we have the subclass that adds the superiority dice back in and has a few extras. I didn't write that up. That might be a thing you decide to do. I feel that this second one, although some of the maneuvers are awkward because of the changes that we've made, it's better than I just swing my sword at things. We've improved what you can do both in combat and out of combat, so I think that makes it worthwhile even without the extra stuff that superiority dice did give you when they had them. And just like in the subclass as it stands, and just like in the first version of our fixed variant.
These fighter variations are designed to give the fighter something to do outside of combat, like in social situations, which was sorely lacking beforehand. In addition to that, it didn't really have that combat specialist, that master fencer, that master combatant feel that it really needed. You'll also notice that this video was a lot shorter than the Fixing the Monk video. That's because Fighter has one or two very specific issues that we already had the tools to fix in the subclasses. So if you like what I came up with, why not subscribe? while you're at it, why not action surge that like button or prove yourself indomitable in the comments? Either way, hopefully I'll see you some other time at my table.